But the main problem, of course, was that once they got there, they couldn't leave. And Israel ended up occupying southern Lebanon for 18 years. As a result of that occupation, you get the formation of Hezbollah, which didn't exist prior to 1982. A Shiite militia, which gradually gets support from Iran, becomes more formidable. And now, some 40 years later, of course, is a real problem for the Israelis, arguably as serious a problem for them as Hamas is as well. So here you have a case where a strategic decision made back in 1982 led to nothing but trouble for the Israelis. And it's like a classic illustration of how their ability to think strategically and enact policies that will leave the country better off over time has been declining over time.
I wanted to start out by talking about a piece you recently wrote for Foreign Policy, where you're a columnist, called The Dangerous Decline in Israeli Strategy. The subhead is, for decades, the Zionist project has been getting worse at defending itself. There's a few places we could start with this. We could start at the beginning, where you think Israel first started making strategic mistakes of some magnitude about 60 years ago. But there's a kind of a pretty topical issue that intersects with your argument at a different point. So a couple of days ago, Israel launched a big aerial assault on Hezbollah targets in Lebanon. Israel said it was to preempt a big Hezbollah strike. In any event, Hezbollah responded with hundreds of rockets. That seems to have not escalated and to have returned to whatever stability was before that all happened. But maybe you could start with by talking about a mistake you think Israel made in the 1980s that contributed to, well, the very creation of Hezbollah and helped shape its character, I guess.
Right. Well, this was the invasion of Lebanon in 1982, which was, I think a classic case of a harebrained scheme, right? The Palestine Liberation Organization had a substantial presence in Lebanon, was still, obviously resisting Israeli efforts to control the West Bank and expand settlements there, etc. And Ariel Sharon came up with this idea that what they ought to do is invade southern Lebanon, scatter the PLO. They were going to actually also engage in sort of local Lebanese politics and get a pro-Israel faction of Christians in power in Beirut. This was going to then completely marginalize the PLO and would give Israel a free hand on the West Bank. Menachem Begin was the prime minister at the time. It wasn't originally his idea, but Sharon convinced him this would all work. And so they launched the invasion, and the invasion went very well in one sense. I mean, they didn't face any substantial opposition at the beginning. They got all the way to Beirut, but the PLO didn't leave. There was this long siege of Beirut. Many Lebanese, of course, were killed. Innocent Lebanese were killed in the process. And eventually the Reagan administration got very upset with this and started putting limits. There were massacres by Christian militias that the Israelis were at least partly complicit in. But the main problem, of course, was that once they got there, they couldn't leave. And Israel ended up occupying southern Lebanon for 18 years. As a result of that occupation, you get the formation of Hezbollah, which didn't exist prior to 1982. A Shiite militia, which gradually gets support from Iran, becomes more formidable. And now, some 40 years later, of course, is a real problem for the Israelis, arguably as serious a problem for them as Hamas is as well. So here you have a case where a strategic decision made back in 1982 led to nothing but trouble for the Israelis. And it's like a classic illustration of how their ability to think strategically and enact policies that will leave the country better off over time has been declining over time.
Okay. And presumably, if Ariel Sharon, he's not alive anymore, is he? If he were alive to hear what you had to say, he might say something like, well, we had to do something. And what what would be on his side of that argument? In other words, what was the PLO doing that was problematic from Israel's point of view?
Well, they were refusing to accept that Israel was going to establish full control of the West Bank. I mean, the taproot of all of these problems is back a little bit earlier, back in 1967, after the Six-Day War, when Israel conquers East Jerusalem and the West Bank and the Golan Heights and the Sinai Peninsula, and decides at that point, kind of in a fit of absent-mindedness, but not entirely, that it's going to begin to colonize the West Bank, that it's going to try to control the entire area. And you can understand why they wanted to do that for purely territorial reasons. It gave them greater strategic depth. But unfortunately, it also meant that you had, over time, roughly an equal number of Israeli Jews and a roughly equal number of Palestinian Arabs, all being controlled by the same government. Well, one of the things the original Zionists had wanted was a Jewish state that was predominantly Jewish. They didn't want a large Arab population as part of it. But in 1967 and in the years subsequently, of course, that policy got reversed. And Israel now, of course, controls, again, roughly the same number of Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs. And that, of course, then led people like Sharon to say, well, we've got to do something about this problem. Maybe what we need to do is invade Lebanon. But they've never come up with an adequate solution for that problem. And we're seeing that play itself out now on a daily basis in Gaza.
Okay. Now, the PLO at that point was very militant, right? I mean, it later became less inclined to use violence as it got drawn into the negotiations and so on. But I assume, I mean, they were staging cross-border raids or something from Lebanon. I mean, they had gotten kind of displaced to Lebanon. Originally, I guess they had been based more in Jordan or something. They wound up in Lebanon, but they were at that point committing acts of violence, right? I assume Sharon would say, well, no state can live with, actors just across the border who keep launching attacks on it, right?
No question. And in fact, the pretext for the invasion of Lebanon was the assassination of, I believe, the Israeli ambassador in London, who was assassinated not by the PLO, actually by another Palestinian faction. One of the things to remember in this period is it's not just the Palestine Liberation Organization and Arafat, but there are other more radical groups. This is before Hamas has emerged, by the way, but it's still a somewhat divided movement, although Arafat's the most important leader within all of those groups. That's the pretext for it. And certainly Israelis had a reason to worry and to be concerned about that. But the problem was in a capacity or incapacity to think beyond trying to address the immediate security problem and figuring out what the long-term political solution is going to be to essentially two sets of people, roughly equal numbers, who both have claims to the same space and are going to have to find some way to either divide it or share it. Right. And unless you're willing to tackle that, you're never going to solve the political problem. And that's what Israeli leaders were unable or unwilling to do, regardless, by the way, of political parties. Right. The settlement enterprise was conducted by labor governments, by Likud governments, by coalition governments as well. It's been across the political horizon ever since the 1970s.
Yeah. Now, it seems to me, and I'm not sure how much you agree with this, but that a big problem with the world, and it's been kind of particularly acute in Israel, is that if the population of a country has any kind of reason to fear anything, the dynamics of political competition, and this is maybe especially true in democracies, will lead some political leaders to try to exploit that and even amplify the fear. And, you see that in the United States. I mean, domestically, you see, Kamala Harris says to fear Trump and Trump says to fear Kamala Harris. And certainly you see lots of politicians saying we need to fear Iran or China or Al Qaeda. And it's not like there's no basis for any of those claims. It's that there are political actors in whose interest it is to actually inflate the threats. And the thing about Israel is, there have always been plausible reasons to feel threatened, right? Ever since, because of the nature of the history of Israel. And in fact, of course, the original citizens of Israel go into the whole project having just been through the Holocaust, and so, kind of feeling threatened. And so it seems to me like this is part of the problem. Before we get into other strategic mistakes you think the leaders have made, it seems to me that there's something about the dynamics of public opinion and politics that encouraged mistakes.
Yeah, no, you're the political psychologist here, but the way you've described it, I think, is a universal tendency. Certainly not unique to Israelis. We saw this dynamic play itself out in the Balkans. We've seen it play itself out after 9/11 here in the United States, after September 11th, where it was very easy to rev up a sense of danger, a sense of threat, even though, in fact, Al Qaeda did not pose an existential threat to the United States. Certainly, many Americans, good friends of mine, were completely alarmed by what they thought might be happening. And you're right that political leaders sometimes are more than happy to exploit this. Right? I think we're seeing, Netanyahu exploit that now. Here's a guy whose political career is hanging by a thread on October 8th of last year, and has managed to, in some respects, not redeem himself, but keep himself in power, in part by revving up a sense of existential danger. So I think that has been part of the backdrop of this conflict all along. And of course, that's true on both sides, right? If you're a Palestinian Arab whose family was expelled in 1947-48 as part of the War of Independence, who's then been living under Israeli occupation, your family fled to the West Bank, you were ruled by Jordan for a while, now you've been ruled by the Israelis, you've been denied political rights for the last 40 or 50 years or so, you would have, it would be very easy to radicalize you and to say, well, there's no point in trying to deal with the other side. We have to find some way to become as strong as they are and then, punish them or whatever. So I think that's a part of this dynamic. And what you hope for is that either particularly far-sighted leaders, and we have had a few at various points here, or outsiders who might be able to take a more detached view, would be able to try and use their influence and, in some cases, use their power to get the actual antagonists to resist or to think their way past the immediate sort of intensification of suspicion, intensification of fear. I think it's a huge problem, and this particular conflict is probably one of the most clear-cut examples of that dynamic at work.